Good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Yep, great. Well, hello and welcome to Intelligence Squared. I'm Josh Clancy, as you know, and I'm delighted to welcome Alastair Campbell here tonight. He doesn't really need a lot of introduction, but I'll give him one anyway. As I'm sure you all know, Alastair was, from 1994 to 2003, he was Tony Blair's spokesperson, chief spokesperson, and then director of communications during the New Labour years. He's also a leading advocate in the field of mental health. He's a prolific author, and most recently, he's co-presenter of, is it the most successful political podcast in Britain? After the News Agents, it's the most successful political podcast in Britain. The rest is politics, which he obviously presents with Rory Stewart. As I said, Alastair's written a lot of books, including a fairly comprehensive account of the Blair years, which I'm sure you've all read. And his latest book, But What Can I Do, was a #1 Sunday Times bestseller. And it's really a sort of, I suppose it's a kind of cri de coeur for what's gone wrong in British politics, but it also attempts to be quite constructive about what can be done. So, very pleased to welcome you here, Alastair. And obviously, this is a sort of quite opportune moment to have a chat about everything, really. There's a lot going on in the world. This is a very political year ahead of us. So, before we start, I would just, acknowledge there's been some quite remarkable breaking news tonight with the announcement that the King Charles, has cancer. Obviously, I don't really want to speculate too much about that or what will happen next, but it did strike me, Alastair, that there's an openness in terms of how the Buckingham Palace and the King have approached this news and other health issues he's had recently that is perhaps different to how we might have approached it in the past.
I think it's been very deliberate and to be welcomed, I think. I mean, it's always a very difficult balance to gauge with any senior public figures when there are health issues, how much or how little you say. And I think that historically, any people in positions of authority, the instinct has been to conceal for as long as you can before you actually admit, as it were. I thought it was interesting, for example, that when he went into hospital recently and they announced the reason, namely this enlarged prostate, that the number of middle-aged and older men who went and checked out their prostate went stratospherically through the roof. So it is a very strange form of soft power that him making the palace making that announcement. So look, as you say, I don't know any more than this very, very brief statement that's been made tonight. But and I guess the one thing we can all pretty much guarantee is that your colleagues in the other newspapers, I've got no doubt what's going to be on the front pages tomorrow.
Yeah, and all week, I expect.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, we haven't had a monarch with a serious illness, certainly in my lifetime. I mean, if the Queen did ever have a serious illness, we never really knew about it. So this is quite new for a lot of us, isn't it?
Yeah. So you'll have to go away tonight and think, well, how does the Sunday Times News Review do something that nobody else has done all week?
Yeah, I've only 3 calls from my editor so far this evening. So, on to politics. The obvious place to start is this year's election. What is more likely, would you say, this year, that Rishi Sunak somehow wins the election or that Burnley stay up in the Premier League? Both long shots.
Neither are guaranteed. Well, that's a very, very good question. I think that, look, I am a professional pessimist in politics. I always have been. And every time I bump into members of the Shadow Cabinet or any of Keir's team, I say, just ignore the polls. When they're like this, ignore them. Because I really genuinely do worry that if you add together the sense of kind of apathy and cynicism that's around about politics anyway, added to which large parts of the media, I don't know why I went like that, large parts of the media...
To stand in for all media.
Large parts of the media are going to be utterly vile about Keir Starmer between now and much of the election. And the election. It's, I keep saying to Keir, it hasn't even started yet. It's going to get very, very nasty. So you put that together with I guess, this is my worry about Labour. I think at the moment there's too much about what Labour are not as opposed to what they are. And that's fine. I think that's fine to have been there for part of this Parliament. But I think to really get the sort of win that I think is there for the taking, I'd like to see more from Labour. But it's very, very hard to see how the Tories survive. It's not just Rishi Sunak. I mean, I feel a bit sorry for him in a way. No, I don't feel sorry. But he's followed the two people who will be analysed in history only for which one was the worst prime minister that we ever had, Johnson and Truss. So he's picked up this thing, and then we've had. But honestly, I can't think of a single thing that's got better in this country in the last 13 years. So I don't understand how they could even think that they might get re-elected. But there's a little part of me that says until people go out and vote, then whoever's in government stays in government. So they have to be voted out. And
well, it's a massive swing as well. I mean, it needs a historic swing.
It's a huge swing. We had Hamza Yusuf on the podcast this morning. I nearly said the newspaper. And I made the point that, because Hamza Yusuf's now got this new line that, Keir Starmer's going to win anyway. And it's a way of saying, so you can still vote SNP. But if Scotland stays as it did at the last election, Labour have to win Jacob Rees-Mogg's seat, which we never did. So the swing is massive. It's bigger than Attlee. It's bigger than Blair. So it's not a done deal. It's not a done deal, which is why you have to get out and vote and persuade your friends to get out and vote as long as it's not for the Tories.
So, I mean, the framework that's often put on the debate at the moment is this a 92 moment or a 97 moment? These are not perfect analogies. No. Clearly it's a 2024 moment. But you were obviously there, well, very much there in 97, but also very much around in 92 as well. Where would you put this election relative to those two, just if you were forced to?
Well, look, how old are you?
18.
Right. So when were you born?
2005.
There you go.
It's about the future, not the past. So he was born in 2005. I was in his primary school this morning. Honestly,
do you want him to answer the question?
Yeah. What is your answer?
92 or 97?
97.
Well, the poll said 97, so I'll probably go with that one.
Okay, he's going with 97.
He's an optimist.
Okay, I was in a school this morning, and it was, honestly, they hadn't heard of David Cameron.
Wow.
They didn't know who David Cameron was.
He is now the Foreign Secretary again.
Yeah, I know, but they don't really follow politics,
fair,
right?
Fair.
So they're kids in a primary school.
Sorry, I didn't realise it was a primary school.
Yes, primary school.
Sorry, right, okay.
Yeah.
I thought it was like an A-level politics
No, it wasn't
class.
politics. It wasn't politics. It was a primary school. Sorry. But this one really cheered me up. They didn't know who Piers Morgan was.
Okay.
Yeah. They didn't know who Arsene Wenger was.
Did they know who Alastair Campbell is?
Well, only because I was there.
Right.
Only because I was there. Because I was going. But so my point is that, look, 92, 97. I remember 1992 vividly because I was still a journalist, but I was covering it. But I was also, and still am, a very close friend of Neil Kinnock. I didn't think Labour were going to win. Because the more that I'd gone around the country and the build-up to it, I met too many people who were saying they were going to vote Tory, who I didn't expect to vote Tory. 97, I thought we were going to win, but I didn't think we were going to win as big as we did. But look, the most obvious comparison is 1997 for these reasons. The Tories have been in for a very long time. There have been a lot of scandals. The country feels stuck. The Labour Party has gone through a process of change since Jeremy Corbyn. So I think that's what feels more kind of fitting to the moment. But at the same time, I think there are other things going on that didn't happen back then. I think that social media, I think the fact that the Tories, I've got no idea what the Tories are up to in terms of campaigning, but it won't be pretty. And it'll be very, very well funded. So I think 97 is my short answer, but it is 2024. And it's a very different political landscape.
So just to let you know, we will be taking some questions at the end, and if you're watching online as well, you can put questions in. To take us back, Alastair, to 97 then, there's this metaphor that's sometimes used that Tony Blair had to was it something about carrying a Ming vase across a room, that basically all he had to do was not drop the election because it was his to win. The sort of popular memory of 97 is things could only get better and parades down Downing Street, and it was all sort of somewhat inspirational in a very British way. But was it like that at the time, or was Blair actually, was it quite a cautious campaign, or did it feel like a sort of a landslide in the making, a momentous moment?
The Ming vase thing was actually Roy Jenkins who said that. He said that his assessment of our campaign was that it was like we were carrying a Ming vase and we were terrified of dropping it. It's interesting. I was interviewed recently for a documentary. Somebody's making a documentary called 1996. It's mainly about football, I think.
This is sort of last, the Oasis and the Euros,
Cool Britannia,
Gaza.
all that stuff. Yeah, it's a lot about Gaza. And so I was interviewed for it. So I thought, the night before the interview, I thought, well, I bet I'll go and check my diaries just to sort of, flick through. So I read through them. And of course, even my sort of institutional memory, because it is of 1997, we were completely clear about what we wanted to do. We were in control. Everything was going well. I read my diary. It was a fucking nightmare. It was like, nothing was going right. It was all, people were falling out with scandals. So I think that I didn't think, on the night of the election itself, Tony and I were up in Sedgefield, and we'd got to the count, where Tony's constituency count, and we were told we'd got about an hour to kill before the result. And we were watching the TV, and I'll never forget this. It was like we were winning in seats where we hadn't even campaigned. There was one moment where this Labour MP came on, and Tony said, "Who is that?" Because it was in a place we hadn't expected to win at all. So that only came at the end. And that's why I say I think it's right to be cautious about predicting landslides or anything else, because, it can go the other way. It can go the other way. The campaign felt pretty good. But, this 28 billion thing that's going on at the moment, where I just wish to hell they'd sort the answer out and fix it. We had a situation, nobody will remember this, but in 1997, the first couple of weeks of the campaign, we had this whole big thing about air traffic control privatisation. That became the big story. Nobody will remember this, right? But it became the big thing for about 4 or 5 days. So you can never quite tell what's going to flare up in a campaign. Campaigns, people can make mistakes as well as do things well. So no, it didn't feel easy at all. It felt really, really hard right to the end.
It's interesting. I'll bring us up to the present now. As you say, that's all ancient history in some ways, but fascinating to compare. But you mentioned the media. I'd actually push back a little bit on that from my vantage point. Certainly, I think Starmer's done pretty well to get on with the Murdoch media, as Blair did as well in '96, famously. And I also think that even the parts of the media that will go for him have struggled thus far to lay a glove on him. I always think about that. Do you remember that ridiculous story the Mail did about the donkey?
Oh, the donkey,
The donkey, yeah. There was sort of a story about this great sort of...
Do people know about the donkey?
Do you want to explain to us about the donkey?
Well, it's the donkey sanctuary.
Right.
So Keir Starmer had a mum who spent a lot of her... She had Still's disease. She was very ill a lot of his childhood. And she liked to sit outside the back and look in this field, and he eventually got the field so that he could save this donkey sanctuary. Which, if you think about it, is quite a nice story about a nice working-class boy doing something nice for his mum. The Mail turned it into a whole thing about how he was like a sort of property speculator, trying to buy it, he was trying to portray him as this sort of... So you're right, they didn't land the glove, but it doesn't mean they won't try. I do think Keir's quite good at being elusive as a target. And Tony was good at being elusive as a target as well. Tony went from being Bambi to Stalin in about 6 months. So they haven't yet decided on how they're going to go for Keir, but that they will, is for sure. Where I think the change has been, I don't think the newspapers are nearly as important as they were for pretty obvious technological reasons, but they still, to my mind, disproportionately set the broader political agenda. Certainly within the Conservative Party. I mean, the Conservative Party, it seems to me, spend all their time talking to the Telegraph, the Mail, and to some extent the Times and the Sun. That is where the conversation's taking place, and the public, well, let's not worry about them too much. So And that then sets the broadcast agenda, which is where I still think a lot of people consume.
Yes.
And even if people say, well, I consume my politics online, which lots of people do, the stuff that is being fed towards them, a lot of it is still being channeled through what a newspaper.
Yeah, it's BBC clips, it's Talk TV clips.
Well, it's like tonight, you know, the news is actually leading on an interview that Piers Morgan has done with Rishi Sunak.
Which no one will watch live,
No.
or few people, but they'll see clips of it, something will go viral.
And I have to say, it's like, have people heard about this interview? So on the one, there's two big stories coming out of it. The first is, Rishi Sunak has admitted that he's not met the health service pledge that he made when he did his 5 priorities. And the second thing is Keir Starmer, Piers Morgan making a £1,000 bet that no refugees will go to Rwanda, okay? And rather ill-advisedly, in my view, Rishi Sunak seems to have taken the bet by shaking Piers Morgan's hand.
Alastair, is it fair to say ill-advisedly is a slight understatement on your part there?
The thing I'd say in Piers Morgan's defence, even though he regularly calls me a liar, I think that might have to do something with the sort of fact that I'm a bit pissed off that he was hacking my phone while he was the editor.
Shots fired.
What?
Shots fired.
Yeah. So if you think about this as a thing, though, is that Piers Morgan, he sees his job, and has done all his life, as trying to get attention for himself and his TV channel now, okay? Rishi Sunak's job is to be the Prime Minister and lead the country. So when I say ill-advised, don't help him, Morgan, do his job at the detriment of you doing your job, which I'm afraid is what happened. And I could feel that from the ripple. People immediately think, oh my God, did he really do that? Well, he did.
Well, it didn't strike me as great politics, and that actually was going to be my next question anyway, which is Rishi Sunak as bad at politics as he seems to be, and if so, why?
Well, I tell you what, you've got to be very, very, very particular to think that the place to announce that you're scrapping HS2 is the Tory party conference in Manchester. That takes a political wizardry that I cannot quite grasp. And also, he's got, look, the thing about politicians is we're all human beings. We try to make them what we want them to be. So people will say, why can't Keir Starmer be a bit more charismatic?
Yeah.
Why can't Rishi Sunak be taller? Well, he can't, right? Why can't he be less rich? Well, because he likes making loads of money, or his wife does. So, you know, they are what they are, but he does seem... I think that I was a journalist when Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister, right? And this goes, you know, more broadly, I think that there probably has been a diminution of the political gene pool. Fewer and fewer people think about going to politics for all sorts of reasons. I hope you guys think about going to politics. I've got a young group down here, by the way. It's just to indicate to the older people at the back. The young ones got here really early. But I think that I'm not sure that Rishi Sunak would have got into Maggie's cabinet.
Right.
I think he might have got a job as a junior minister. But I think that's... I don't want to be personal, I don't want to be rude, but I kind of think that's his level. Sorry, I hope that wasn't personal and rude.
But that is an issue that is much broader than Rishi Sunak. The calibre of, and it's partly because we've been through about 3 sets of Tory politicians at this point.
Yeah.
So we are sort of.
And Johnson, who terrible human being, but he threw out people like Rory Stewart, Ken Clarke, you know, David Gore, people who you could at least look at and think, I can imagine them as cabinet ministers. I don't think they're ridiculous people. So he got rid of all them. So now, I mean, honestly, there are people who have been, you know, just think, we live in a country where for the rest of her life, Liz Truss will get an allowance for the fact that she was the Prime Minister. Liz Truss, just remember this, she will be at the cenotaph every year.
See, I think that's a curse, though.
Well,
I think she'll hate it.
Yeah, but she probably, though, she will love it. She'll love it because it'll be her reminder So I just think that's absurd. But if I think back to the Thatcher Major time, right, and it's amazing, isn't it? I mean, John Major, when he came on the podcast, I remember sitting there thinking, I used to be vile about this guy. And I now think, God, I wish he was back. You know, even Theresa May, I think, I wish she was back. I mean, what's happened to me? So I think there has been a diminution. But the truth is, you don't need that many really, really good people. You need a few really, really good people. And then you need a very large cohort of good, strong, competent people. But I feel at the moment we neither have the really good people nor the competent cohort. And it's terrible, it's terrible. They've got to go. And then I hope that Labour can come in and really give the country a sense of energy and direction and change, because I mean, these guys, their generation, I was in a school the other day, right, and this girl, she was about 15, and she actually got a laugh. She didn't mean to get a laugh. She got a laugh in the classroom, but I felt really sad by what she said. She said, has politics always been this bad? And I just thought, that's all she's known. I said, well, what was your first memory of politics? She said, it was my parents arguing about Brexit. And I just think that since Brexit, this country has completely lost its way politically.
So I think towards the end, we'll get back to a little bit of the more constructive stuff on what can be done there. But I just wanted to ask you a little bit about leadership, which is a great theme of your writing and podcasting, and Starmer. On the one hand, I think he's exhibited some quite strong qualities of leadership in terms of the way he's taken control of the party again, and he's very ruthless. On the other hand, as you've alluded to, he doesn't, I don't think even he would say he's a hugely charismatic man. He doesn't give a resounding speech. Lots of people say they find him a bit dull and a bit boring. How do you assess him as a leader, his strengths and weaknesses? Well,
look, I think the assessment you have to make is based upon what he's done to take the Labour Party from where it was. Now, accepted, he's had a lot of help from the Tories, okay? But he's gone from a place where in 2019, people were really beginning to think as the Labour Party had its day. I remember doing an interview on the day, on the day of the defeat, saying that no party has a divine right to exist. So he's gone from that to a place where now the criticism he gets is, why isn't it absolutely blindingly obvious that there's going to be a massive landslide? So I think you'd have to say that he's done a pretty good job at showing the change. And I can remember after the Hartlepool by-election, he came round for a cup of tea, because, he lives quite near us, and he came round for a cup of tea, and I was in, I'm quite kind of...
and that was the nadir, really, wasn't it?
It really was, and I was saying, Keir, I don't understand, what is the strategy, what is the plan? I don't see what's going on. And he said, and I've seen him say this many, many times since, and I've seen other people say it, and it's the moment when I realised that I think, actually, he does have quite a strategic mind. It just works differently to the way that I define strategy. Doesn't mean that's right or wrong. Either of us are right or wrong. And he said this. He said, look, I've got to try to do in one parliamentary term 3 stages. First stage, show the Labour Party is not the Corbyn party. It's changed. And people have got to understand that. Okay. Now, here we are in pretty much Jeremy Corbyn territory. Hands up if you think the Labour Party has changed in the last few years. Okay, so that's pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
Second stage, he said, show that the Conservatives are unfit to govern.
Well, as you say, he may have had a bit of help. May have had some help, yes.
But yeah. I think, and also I do think, and it's true, he's not a Barack Obama orator. He's not a Bill Clinton, get the hairs on your neck standing up. But I think both his speaking and his interviews and his performance in Parliament have all improved. And that's an important point as well, because he's not much younger than I am. He's getting on a bit, right? But he has improved at all of those things. But I think the third part, he then said, and then the third part is to show, if not them, why us, and that has to be about policy. Now, that's the bit that I think they really need to kind of focus on and crank up now. And I think what they're doing is getting the negatives out of the way. I hope what they're doing, they've got these 5 missions. I hope those 5 missions, by the time of the election, turn into some pretty clear, concrete stuff that everybody knows and everybody understands. And the thing is, at the moment, I feel the country is really, in most elections, you've got an opposition, And people are kind of, this definitely happened with Jeremy Corbyn. I think it happened with Neil back in 1992. You got people who think, well, I might be tempted, but I want to find reasons not to vote for them. Mm. I think with Labour at the moment, if they could just be a bit less defensive, I think the country's looking for reasons to vote for them. Mm. And it's a different dynamic. So give us the reasons to vote for. We had a friend, we go to France a lot, and we've got a friend out there who lives near where we go, and this guy, he's British, but he's voted Tory all his life. Mm. And he says, I cannot vote Tory again. I cannot vote Tory. But he said, but Starmer has to give me a song to whistle to. And I thought it was a really good phrase. It was like, what is the song forget the Tories, what am I whistling to? And that's what I'd like to see in the next bit. But you used the word ruthless, by the way, and I think he is quite ruthless, and that is not to be underestimated in politics.
Well, he's also, as you pointed out, he is more strategic than people give him credit for. I think he worked out quite early on that it was going to be good politics to be ruthless with the Corbynite left, yeah, when there was a clear crossing of the boundaries he'd set. And so he's not been afraid to do it, really, from day one.
Yeah, yeah. Listen, you know, Tony was seen as a pretty strong, bold leader in lots of different ways, but would Tony have actually expelled Jeremy Corbyn from the party? Well, he never did. Mm.
But go back to 97 for a moment. There was a lot of money in the kitty then, or a lot more money in the kitty then. And so Blair and Gordon Brown could lay out basically improving public services through spending, which they then, to some extent did. Clearly that's not the case anymore. So just structurally, he's at quite a disadvantage there.
No, it's different. It's definitely different. I mean, look, I think that the Tories are very, very good at writing long-term narratives, okay? So if you listen to them now, you say, 1997, you inherited a sort of golden age. It's absolute bollocks. There was inflation back in the system and massive unemployment. So we had a lot of economic problems we had to hit. But what is true, not just economically, I'd say economically, socially, culturally, strategically, on the security front internationally, I think Labour, if they win, will inherit a much trickier wicket than we did. Mm. I really do think they will. And I think there's two things I'd say about that. One, that is why you do have to have a sense of a long-term vision and be clear about what that is and what sort of time frame you're talking about. The country will listen to somebody, even though they know it takes 2 elections, they'll listen to people talking about 10 years. A decade to do this, a decade to do that. And the second thing I'd say is that if and when Labour get in, you have to you get energy, you get momentum through change. That will, the thing about the sort of flag waving in Downing Street and what have you, you do have moments that can give you a sense of this is change, this gives you energy, this gives you momentum. And during the period, because the truth is, in our political system, change does take time. Turning around the health service, it's going to take a long time. He talks about growth through reform of the planning system. That is not going to be easy. So you're going to have, alongside that, what I call cost-neutral campaigning and policy issues. And the one for me that I think really lends itself to Keir Starmer's personality and to Labour Party values is actually about trying to restore values in public standards in public life.
Right.
I think the Labour Party underestimate the power that there is in saying to the public, you know what, saying to that girl, no, politics wasn't always this bad. Politics doesn't always have to be this bad. We are going to restore basic standards in public life. And I would love it, for example, if he stood up and said, you know what, John Major, he was right when he talked about the need for the Nolan principles. He was right when he talked about we should have an expectation of honesty in public life. There should be openness, there should be transparency. We should be here to serve, not to help ourselves with all this. I mean, the levels of corruption that are happening in our politics now, I am staggered. I'm staggered that with one or two exceptions, this stuff going up in Teesside and the Freeport stuff at the moment is happening with next to no debate. And look, there was a report last week saying that they haven't proven corruption, but they've certainly established governance systems that simply aren't working. So I think if he were to stand up and say all that and then say, and mean it, if a single minister in a Labour government offends any one of those 7 Nolan principles, they are out. And then he has to do it. And I think it would transform people's perception of politics. At the moment, you know, I've spent all my life defending politics, and the book really is a defense of politics, okay? But at the moment, when somebody says to me, this school I went to today in Dagenham, I arrived a bit early, and I went to this cafe just to get a cup of coffee. And there's a guy sitting next to me, he recognised me, starts talking, what have you. And he said, I mean, the trouble is, they're all in it up to their necks. They're all in it for themselves. And now people have said that about politics forever, okay? And I've always argued that it's not true. But I kind of look at the recent government, and I get why he's saying it. So Labour, I think, can change that. So I would say, go for the cultural stuff. You know, go for the changing standards in public life. And I also think, by the way, things like the arts and culture, which are so often being seen as kind of like, Melvin Bragg made this speech in the House of Lords this week. It was really good. And he said, you know, arts and culture aren't the cherry on the cake, they are the cake. And I think Britain, you know, we've had all this guff from Johnson and Truss about world beating this and world beating that. You know, we've got an army now that you can fit inside the bloody Etihad. You know, and he's talking about, I mean, it's just nonsense. And then he says he'd sign up for conscription. Did you see that? I mean, so I think that where we can be world-beating is if we can restore the values, genuine respect for rule of law and democracy and all that, but also in culture, we can be a cultural superpower. So that's the sort of vision I want to see from Keir.
So that lack of trust in politics and in politicians, I mean, as you say, 'twas ever thus to some extent, but clearly it's got worse in recent years. Where do you root that to? I mean, how much of that is about Brexit and the Brexit wars? Do you go back further? Lots of people might say the Iraq War, and which obviously you were a central figure in, you know, the Blair government taking Britain to war in Iraq was a great loss of trust in politics. So where do you...
I think, look, there's never been a kind of halcyon period when people have thought, oh, I love my politicians, and, you know. But I think politicians have always had a certain respect, a residual respect. I think there have been a number of things. I think MPs' expenses did a huge amount of damage. I think the global financial crisis, I say in the book, I think the real trigger for this successful populism was the global financial crisis, where people felt the people who caused it got away with it and we, the people, paid a price. Iraq, definitely. I think that you have to accept that, you know, I know Tony didn't lie, I know I didn't lie, but when you have made as part of your case the fact you have stated in your honest conviction that this is about tackling Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction, and the inspectors go in and they don't find them, that's a pretty obvious trust moment. So all of these things come together, and I think, you know, more recently, I do think that, I think one of the reasons why, I saw a very interesting polling presentation by John Curtis a few weeks ago. The two moments that have really moved the dial in our politics in recent years have been Partygate and the Truss mini-budget. Partygate, I think, I think people felt genuinely fundamentally offended by that.
Yes.
And offended by the lying that then followed. But I think that, for my point, I do think Brexit's a big factor in this, because I think that as a country, we've moved on from the single most important and significant change that has been made through the ballot box. We've moved on from it, despite the fact that it did involve lies and law breaking, and there has been no accountability for either. So Johnson went eventually because of the lies over Partygate. He's never been held accountable for Brexit. So I think all of that combines to make people think, well, is there much point getting involved? And that's what I'm trying to address in the book, is yes, there is, because we have to get more and better people involved in the political process.
Dealing with Brexit, I mean, I sometimes wonder if, in recent years, well, you mentioned HS2 earlier, and sometimes I wonder if actually what Brexit, and to some extent the pandemic too, have done is actually reveal a sort of deeper rot that had set in beforehand. And this is
what, within public service?
Yeah, and within public life, and within our institutions, and that actually we'd sort of been drifting. It's a bit like, you know, if you have a terrible breakup in your life or something, and then you suddenly realise that actually your friends, you'd sort of drifted from them for quite a while or something. And to what extent do you put Britain's predicament now down to Brexit versus this kind of deeper malaise that...
I think Brexit was the peak. And look, I do think there's been you mentioned institutions. Part of what populism does is to undermine institutions. Because the institutions which are there to hold politicians to account, to ensure the rule of law, to ensure a free and fair media, all these institutions, if you're a populist who's trying to say to people, I can solve this complicated problem by giving you a simple slogan that you can sort of tie your flag to, then the institutions fall victim to that. And I actually think, I say in the book, I think we have to do a better job of protecting the institutions, particularly, and that's difficult from a progressive perspective. Normally the progressives are the ones who are saying the institutions have to be modernised and changed. But actually, I think the rule of law in particular, we've got to be really, really careful about that. But I think there has been a kind of a rot. I do think, I hate doing that thing where journalists can say, oh, you always blame the media. I'm not only blaming the media. I do think that media coverage of politics has been really corrosive about politics, and politics has not done a good job of defending itself. And our political system doesn't lend itself to it. I think, for example, that, you know, the fact that most of what people see of politics is a minister says something, the shadow minister attacks it, and then somebody comes along and says, well, it's probably not going to work anyway. And the sort of general sense is this dysfunctional. And I do think, I really think we need to have a complete overhaul of the whole political system, starting with political education in schools, which is why I keep going to schools and trying to talk to kids about politics, lowering the voting age, compulsory voting, definitely a look at the electoral system. I'm not one of those people who thinks PR is some kind of panacea. It's not. But our electoral system feels broken. Probably even greater devolution to the towns and cities and regions and the nations of the UK. I just feel we're at a point where we feel broken. It feels broken, and the only way to fix it is to be honest about that, and then to say, okay, as a country, what are we going to do about that? And I worry that the election is going to be about very small things when it should be about big things.
It's funny you mention ministerial announcements, because it's something we've noticed at the Sunday Times in the last year or two, which is readers aren't responding to your classic political interview anymore. They're not really interested in reading sort of old-fashioned political coverage anymore. So we're actually having to look at quite different ways to cover politics and connect it to people's lives or issues. Yeah. So, you know, in the sense that the media does have to respond to its readers, that there is seemingly a shift out there.
I hope there is, because I think it's become incredibly formulaic. You know, if you think about it, you get the Sunday papers, they go into the Sunday shows, the same person does the rounds, says the same thing, that leads the news for the day, that sets the debate for the Monday. And I think for a lot of people, they're just not even listening anymore.
I think that system's breaking down, I really do.
Well, I hope it does. I hope it does. It needs to.
From the front line, that's how it looks to me. But,
yeah. And to be honest, that's why I mean, I've been absolutely stunned by the success of our podcast, but I think it is actually because it's just a bit more thoughtful and deep than what I think people feel they're getting from turning on the telly and watching the news.
Well, we can thank Rory Stewart for that, but...
That's definitely the best line so far. And he will be so happy. And I know there's a friend of his who's here tonight who'll be texting him right now saying...
You mentioned populism. Obviously, there are many other big elections happening this year. India, we just had Taiwan, but there'll be a lot of attention on America. You're quite a keen student of American politics. I'm not going to ask you who's going to win, because it's something akin to a coin toss, but what do you make of it all? I mean, I have written in the past, I spent a few years in Washington, that I just thought from day one they were mad to run Joe Biden again, given his age and, you know, sort of general vibe. What do you think? Do you think that was a mistake, or is that premature, do you think?
Well, if you see it from his perspective, I mean, Trump is an awful phenomenon, but he is a phenomenon. And, you know, I spoke to Hillary Clinton when she was in Belfast for the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And, you know, I said, it's really hard to look back. It must be incredibly hard for her. She's written a whole book about how hard it is. But I don't know what she could have done differently in the campaign, because she was up against this phenomenon. This
she could have gone to Wisconsin. That was the...
She could have lots of coulda, woulda, shoulda. But my point is on the strategy she pursued. I can understand it. Now, Biden did beat him. He beat him. And we talked to this guy, Tucker Eskew, on the podcast last week, who's a Republican strategist who's now in the kind of anybody but Trump camp. And he said, the thing you have to understand about, to become the American president, you have to think that you can be the American president. And even though lots of people might say, oh, I could do that, very, 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 very few people on earth say to themselves, do you know what, I could be American president, and mean it. Joe Biden thinks he can still be American president. And I think unless Jill, his wife, says to him, Joe, don't do it, which there's no sign she is saying that, he's going to go for it. At which point, then it has to become, well, do you want him or do you want the other guy? Now, I agree with you. I think that a lot of people will be thinking, eek, you know, is he going to survive 4 years? Do we really want Kamala Harris, etc.? Equally, I still think he's got a good record to point to. He's a pretty good campaigner. And Trump, albeit he's a phenomenon, he's actually a pretty easy political target. But I agree, you know, everybody I talk to in America says, you know, can't they both just disappear? That's kind of the feeling of it. I think Biden will win, though.
Well, there was, I mean, the reason he won last time, well, the main reason he won was that there was a constituency, and they call them swing voters, call them moderates, who just couldn't face Trump again.
Yeah.
They didn't necessarily like Biden, they're not necessarily liberal, but they just thought, this guy, we just want to switch him down, switch him off, turn the volume down, and they were just exhausted by it. And I do think that constituency is still there. But you must be pretty worried by some of the polling at the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, we're 9 months out. But
the polling is horrific. But don't forget, if you go back to the midterms, Trump was dead. Trump was finished. It was all over. Things swing around very, very quickly. I still think I mean, Trump clearly thinks that every time he's on every time he's got the chance to be on TV in one of these courtrooms, he takes it, because thus far it's helped him up. I think it could go the other way quite quickly. I think there will come a point where the legal troubles become too bad, and also but you know, your initial question was, what do I think has happened? I find it unfathomable. I mean, I covered Thatcher Reagan. I actually mentioned in the book about a speech look up Reagan's last speech as American president, okay? It's an amazing piece of oratory. But the other thing that's incredible about it, you couldn't imagine Donald Trump saying one word that he says. It's actually a paean of praise to immigrants. It's an amazing speech. So what has gone, and the other thing, we talked to Tucker about this, is that, because he's a kind of big Christian guy, I just don't know what's happened in the American psyche. Have you seen the Trump Made God film?
The Trump what?
God Made Trump.
No, I haven't.
Oh, you've got to see it.
It's about evangelicals.
Yeah, it's the evangelicals have made this film called God Made Trump. It's not funny. It's terrifying. It's terrifying that they believe that. So what has happened to that psyche? I just don't know the answer to that question. You probably have a better feel for it because you lived there.
Yeah, well, I spent a lot of time in those evangelical churches, mostly getting COVID, but that's another story. So, crystal ball, say imagine Trump does win and Starmer wins. How does Starmer approach that? I mean, even for the campaign, they're already having to reach out because you need to have relationships and that sort of thing. We're as closely allied to America as we ever were, really. Possibly, you know, you see us bombing together in the Middle East yet again. How does Starmer and Labour approach Trump?
It's tricky. It's tricky. I think you have to do it like Theresa May did it. You could tell from the body language that Theresa May was not enjoying it, but she said the right things. And I think you have to do that. But you also have to reach a point where sometimes you have to call him out. But I think that, I don't imagine there's a single person in this hall who thinks that, not just Keir Starmer, but I suspect Rishi Sunak would be really worried about the return of Trump. I mean, the whole thing with NATO is terrifying.
Yeah.
It's terrifying. You know, and it's not just the fact that he can think about it, it's the fact that he can do it on a whim. And what happened last time is that, you know, we all persuaded ourselves that he'll get in there, but then the grown-ups will surround him. The grown-ups were kept out of the room, and then the ones that he got in there, even they couldn't cope with it.
But
so
they did hem him in.
They hemmed him in. They hemmed him in. But a Trump that comes back having, you know, what is it? Is it the Washington Post? That's 5 million words of lies. They've got this database of all the lies he told as president. It goes to 5 million words. You've had the insurrection. You've had people dying as a result of it. You've had scandal upon scandal. You've had this recent libel case. I mean, we're talking about a level of this should normally do for a political career that is up there. And yet, he's still in the fight. So that he will be so emboldened if he wins. He literally will be able to think he can pick up the phone to Zelensky and say, Vladimir, it's over.
You're on your own, son.
Yeah, you're on your own, mate. You know, it's up to you. Do you want to lose the whole country, or do you want to lose what you've lost already? Because I've now got to go and talk to Kim Jong-un to say thanks for the nice letter he sent me last week. You know? So I think it's terrifying.
So I always think it's a great danger sometimes in British politics to try and draw too many conclusions from American politics.
Yeah.
But I would say, looking at Biden, it seems to me that one weakness that he has accrued is that he hasn't really been seen to do anything about immigration. Do you think that's something that Starmer should take note of, whether in his campaign or if he does become Prime Minister, that actually he can't afford to sit on his hands on that issue?
You look, and not, by the way, not just Keir Starmer, right across Europe, this is like really big at the moment and very, very difficult. And you either have to, I mean, what Angela Merkel did in, you know, taking in 1 million and Wir schaffen das and all that, was very big, very bold, very brave, and you could argue the right thing to do. The political consequences have been pretty profound. You now have a situation, so here we are, we're talking about, you know, could Britain get back into the European Union? You know, there is an argument to be made about whether it is developing into a European Union that we want to be in. You've got the Sweden Democrats now in government. You've got the, we've just had an election in Finland, which actually was pretty good from the progressive perspective. But you've got Maloney already in power. You've got the AFD, you know, I've been really impressed by these protests against them, but the reason for them is because they are now so high in the polls in several parts of the country. You've got Wilders.
So is the conclusion from that Brexit wasn't such a bad idea after all?
No. Brexit remains. How dare you come to my event?
First question to that.
No, I still think it was a terrible thing to do. And by the way, I think one of the worst things about it is that Europe has lost the influence of the UK within it. I imagine that the Franco-German alliance, which has always been a big motor, would have been strengthened by a departure. Bizarrely, it's been weakened. So you've got Marine Le Pen. She's pretty much doing nothing at the moment, but she could win. You've got the AFD, as I say, on a path to government. They're not going to be the biggest party, but they could be in a position where they have to be part of government. So that's, you know, that's all evolving, and a lot of that is to do with immigration. So yes, it has to be addressed, but I still think that, you know, one of the reasons I'm not a nationalist, I'm not a supporter of the SNP, but I do think it's good that we've at least got one party that sort of speaks up for immigration. And let's be honest, we as a country, getting older and older, artificial intelligence coming along the way that it is, you know, the need for immigration is not going to dry up anytime soon. So I just wish that we could be a bit more honest about that. But Keir I think, is playing, I completely support what he's trying to do. Politically, he has to do what he's doing on immigration.
So a couple more questions from me, and then we're going to go to the audience. So have a think on what you might want to ask. You mentioned cynicism earlier, and that's quite a big theme of the book as well, is resisting cynicism. I wonder if you might talk a bit more about that. What can one do? What are the more constructive approaches to politics that can overcome the mistrust, the cynicism, the apathy, frankly, that has set in for a lot of people?
Well, it's hard. It's really hard, and I get why. I think first of all, one of the things I try to do in the book is to be fair and reasonable about politicians as a breed. There have been some terrible people in politics, through history. But in the main, it's a pretty tough job. It's a difficult thing to do. You put yourself out there, particularly in the modern age, you get loads of abuse. So I think we should, all of us, try to see something positive in them. I think, more importantly, I think we should try to resist, and this is really hard, and it's going to get harder because of AI and fake news and all that stuff. We should try to resist going for the first thing that comes at us about any issue. We should try to inform ourselves better. And we should take more ownership, I think, of what we think about politics as individuals and as communities. And it's very hard to do. I found myself, there was a classic example today. There's a poll doing the rounds, and it says that Labour support among the Muslim community has halved since October the 7th. Right. It's not true. It's not true. When you go down to the numbers, it's way more complicated than that. But that's the kind of thing that I think. So when I saw it, I thought, okay, interesting, need to check it out. Now, what you can't do, you can't spend your whole life being a kind of, your own journalist. You can't do that. But I think that what I would say is have skepticism about everything that is put towards you, but don't have cynicism. Don't imagine that everybody's lying to you. Don't imagine that things can't be improved. Don't imagine that things can't work. And look for and enjoy the stuff that does work. And, there's plenty of it. There's plenty of it.
Yeah, I mean, one positive aspect of the immigration issue is that lots of people still want to come and live in this country, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would also say I'm extremely biased on this, but I generally find actually not going to social media for my news, but actually reading newspapers I trust first gives me much, because they have gone through the poll and actually crunched the numbers or what.
Yeah. What I tend to do for my own kind of, because it's very hard to know how. I was in a secondary school last week, 17, 18-year-olds. One person physically read a paper. About 3 watched the BBC, 1 watched Sky, none watched GB News. So they were all on kind of different social media stuff, but actually they were talking about all the same things, so they were kind of getting there. What I do when I'm interested in something, I do now go and I've got one of my golden rules is read books, not newspapers. Sorry.
As long as you're reading.
But you can do both. You can do both. And the other thing is I have a little sort of Michael Gove in my head saying, we're sick and tired of experts, and I go and find a genuine expert on something. And I Google them, and I see if they've said anything about, and if they haven't, I might send them an email and say, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, of course, not everyone's in a position to do that.
I think we are, though. We are. We are in a position to do that.
Well, they might not reply.
They might not. Well, they don't always reply to me.
That's fair. Last question from me, and then we'll move to the audience. Just on the book, it was a #1 bestseller, it says here.
Yeah.
So, what impact have you noticed it having, and how did that? You obviously had hope for it in terms of how the impact it would have. Did it live up to expectations?
It's very hard to measure. You'll be pleased to know, as a Rory Stewart fanboy, that his book has sold even better. Somebody tell Rory I said that as well. I don't know. It's very hard to measure. Very hard to measure the impact of a book. I showed you the book I was reading, The Backstage, The Boy with the Striped Pyjamas. It sold 11 million copies in 50 languages. I don't know how you measure the impact, but I've been struck by, when I've gone into schools in particular. Today, classic example. So my next book's actually politics for primary schools. So I'm going in to talk to primary schools and what have you. So today I was with this school council. And so these were the last year, so 10-year-olds in the main. And I said, come on then, would any of you think about going into politics? no way, they said. So then we talked about it for an hour, and by the end, I asked them the same question. And I said, right, come on, would any of you think about going into politics? And I had about 5 maybes. I have had messages, letters from people who've said that it's made them think differently about politics. That's a minimum I'd like to achieve. And then I have had some. I had a letter the other day from a guy who's decided, as a result of reading the book, to try to get a seat. Now, I had a chat with him, and I said, I think, you know, where things are in the electoral cycle, you might think about going for a council seat first. But he's decided he's going to try and get on a shortlist. Fair enough. So I've definitely had people who've said that it's made them want to get. I say in the introduction to the book that my vision for it, I like to have long-term vision, I like to visualize things, is that on the day I die, in about 40 years, on the day I die, that the then Prime Minister says that this book made them go into politics.
Okay. Moderately ambitious.
Happen. It could happen.
Moderately.
Could be one of these guys.
Okay, so we are going to open up to questions.
I hope we've got some lights.
We are going to have some lights. We're going to have some microphones.
Also, by the way,
I
know this venue. I know this venue quite well because I come to lots of folk music events that are here. All I can say is, I hope you brought cushions. Have you? Because they're not the comfiest pews, are they? No, no.
Keeps everyone alert.
You know, next time, bring a cushion.
You've heard this before, but please do ask questions. Please don't make statements. I beg you. Okay, so where are the roving mics? Do you want to just find a couple of... find a pew with a couple of people that have their hands up. That looks like a good place to start.
Hello. Hi, Alastair.
Hello.
So a lot of my friends at the moment are really, really pissed off with the Labour Party about their stance on the ceasefire, etc.
Yeah.
How do I convince them to go and vote and that it's about more than that?
Well, is that what you want to do?
Yeah, I want to convince them that they still need to vote.
You don't share their anger?
Well, I do share their anger.
Right.
But I still want to
vote. I suppose all we can do is try to explain why you think their position is as it is, and then, even if that fails to persuade them on the specific issue, say that, you know, in the end, you have to decide whether that is going to stop you from actually allowing this Conservative government to continue. Because in the end, that is the choice. There's no such thing as a perfect candidate. There never has been. Abraham Lincoln was not a perfect human being. Nelson Mandela was not a perfect human being. Now, on the position about why I think why Labour's position is as it is several reasons. The first is I think they don't want it to be their main thing. That's a sort of tactical political thing. That if and when Keir Starmer does become Prime Minister, one of the most important relationships he's going to have is with the United States. He will, as Prime Minister, have way more influence on this debate than he has now. Does he really want to use up political capital now with the Americans in a way that would make your friends feel a bit better for a few days before they then probably got pissed off with the 28 billion thing? Okay? So I think it's explaining, it's trying to explain that the position that he's adopted is not as simple, cannot be met just by a slogan or an act, which you think will have no consequences, but it could have consequences. Does that make sense? And then I think on the bigger picture, it's, you know, this is the worst government for young people there has ever been. And, you know, in a sense, you've got to say to them, just get off your high horse and vote Labour.
Okay, there's a lady there in the beige-ish.
Yeah, we're only taking questions from women.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, new rules.
Okay. Hi. So I think it's very obvious to sort of everybody really that the state of society and all of our institutions are in a pretty sort of abhorrent position, and that's obviously due to sort of the decade plus of horrendous policies under current and previous governments. So it's obviously fair to say that whoever comes into power, and hopefully that is Labour, will have a horrendous sort of challenge ahead of them. So what advice would you sort of give to the hopefully incoming Labour government about how we reframe and change the narrative that we've kind of got around us about Labour being not a safe pair of hands with the economy? And what do you think our priorities should be when it comes to public spending?
It's interesting you frame your question like that because, of course, I would say that one of the reasons why some of your friends probably are a bit pissed off with Labour is that the framing of economic safety, security, not frightening the horses is very much the kind of driving economic narrative. It was interesting, Rachel Reeves and Keir both spoke at this big business event the other day, and it was very much aimed at them, reassuring them. So, and I think that's sensible politics. I think that in terms of spending, look, it's going to be really difficult. There's no doubt about that. It's going to be very, very difficult. The demands are going to be enormous. You've got local government in this country that is facing meltdown, literally some of them facing bankruptcy. You've got, as I said earlier, you've got this report from the Defence Select Committee that is really saying our defences now are not in a fit state for the scale of danger that we're facing. You've got people desperate for the health service to be built up. You've got education that is, you literally got schools falling to bits. So rebuilding the public realm, when you say what would my priority be for public spending, it's rebuilding the public realm. But it's going to take a lot of time. And I think it's just being honest about that. But then I think there has to be, what I hope for Keir Starmer, I think, I'm reading a book at the moment, Nick Thomas-Symonds, who's a member of the Shadow Cabinet, he's written some very, very good biographies of past Labour leaders. And I'm reading his book about Clement Attlee at the moment. And I hope, my big hope for Keir Starmer is actually he's going to be, you say 92, 97, that it's going to be more 1945. That it's actually, that he's going to get in, and then the country will be ready for all sorts of things that aren't even being talked about at the moment, because the language is very much about, it's about tax, it's about borrowing. I think we're going to have to completely reconfigure how public services are delivered. Artificial intelligence is going to be an important part of that. So I'm hoping that it will be all of those public services, but it will be in taking a completely different approach across the piece. And I think the country will be ready for that.
Hopefully no rationing. If you're upstairs, we are going to get to you, but you have to queue at the mic, I'm told. I don't know where the mic is, but if you queue at the mic, we will get to you.
There's a mic there, isn't it? That's a mic.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. They're standing mics.
And that's the mic. See, if I was up there, I'd grab that mic and I'd sing. And this guy looks like a singer. Look at him. No? I mean, the leather jacket is pretty... Okay, we'll see.
Do you have a question? Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. We've got one on the iPad first, which is from our digital audience. Counterfactual. If Starmer loses the next election, what do you think happens to Labour then? And I will double that up with a question of my own, which is, if you were advising Rishi Sunak, how would you advise him to win this election? So maybe start with that, and then counterfactual. If Starmer loses, what happens?
Well, I'll tell you what I would have advised, in fact I did, publicly on the podcast, as it were. When Sunak started as Prime Minister, I said he has got a very, very brief window of opportunity to signal that he genuinely represents change. And he kind of said the right things, integrity, professionalism, accountability, but then he didn't do it. And I'll tell you the moment when I started to think this guy just hasn't got it was the privileges report into Johnson. I mean, he literally did a runner to avoid being seen. He didn't vote on it. He didn't talk about it. It was like, just let it go. It'll go away. It won't go away. Because as I said in that polling thing, the Partygate thing really cut through to people. So I think now what he would do, look, I think the best thing he could do, and this is why the ridiculous thing with Piers Morgan tonight goes against us, the thing he should be doing is being the Prime Minister, governing the country, being serious. I think the way he comes, how many people, by the way, watch Prime Minister's Questions? I'm really fascinated by this stuff. Quite a few.
Probably quite sort of politically focused audience.
Yeah. None of them in the primary school today
Yeah.
had ever watched it. But I just find his whole shtick at Prime Minister's questions, I think, is completely counterproductive. He should be serious. He should be serious. He should be measured. He should be practical. I just think he's listening to these politicos who are trying to tell him this is how you win a campaign. I think you said something very interesting about the way newspapers are adapting to this new sense of what politics is. The campaigners need to do that as well. People are sick of that stuff. So I actually think Keir, when he stands up there and just kind of, he's just a bit, you know, people can say he's dull, but he's sort of serious. I think people think he's serious, and I think that's what Starmer should try to, Sunak should try to be.
And just to that point, if Starmer does lose, what happens? Does it swing back to the left, Labour, or?
Listen, if Labour don't win, but by the way, if Sunak wins, I think it'll be the first time ever that any party has won as many elections as this lot have, right? And you've got to remember this for Labour. I like to say this because I'm one of the few people still standing who will always defend Tony Blair. And I don't even get paid for it these days. Not by him, anyway.
You're about the only person that doesn't at this point.
Yeah, he's built up a very good organisation. But if you go through the last 11 elections in this country, it goes like this, from a Labour perspective. Lost, 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 lost. Blair, 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 lost, 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 right? So if Labour lose again, then I think the Labour Party has an existential question to answer.
Okay, we've got two. Let's take two questions from both of you up there.
Sure. Hi, Alastair.
Hello.
Aside from maybe encouraging people to go to be a politician, to be an MP or whatever, what about potentially encouraging people to work in the civil service, work in political journalism? I feel like that's also fallen off, really. And so what would your advice be to someone who's maybe thinking about that but maybe has doubts?
Yeah.
Well, let's just take the second question from...
Thank you, Alastair. Sunak brought back an undisputed failure in Cameron into government. If Keir becomes Prime Minister, should he invite an extraordinarily successful and able person in Tony Blair? And if so, in what capacity? And would he be interested?
Good question. Very good question.
Right, well, I'll take the first one because it's easier. No, you're absolutely right. And by the way, the book has got a whole thing about politics is not just politicians. Politics is campaigners. Politics is think tanks. Politics is, as you say, the civil service. They shouldn't be political, but it's part of the political process. Politics is local parties. It's campaigners. Politics is anything and anyone who decides to use their voice to try to make a difference. So my advice to everybody is, first of all, decide whether you want to make a difference. Once you've just, and most people do, once you've done that, decide what are the things you really, really care about, and then decide how are you best placed to do that. Now, for some people, I know lots of people who are absolutely passionate about issues, but would no more want to be an elected politician than fly to the moon. They just couldn't imagine themselves doing it, but they do other things. You know, so I think your question is a brilliant question, because that is the mindset I think we all have to have. The question is, but what can I do? That is why I call the book, What Can I Do? What can I do? What can you do? And then within the time frame that you have from your profession, your family, other interests in your life, wanting to be a normal human being, what time can you commit? Then how do you commit it? And I do think, I think to change the scale of change that I think this country needs, it's going to need way more than a change of government. It's going to need way more than politicians to do it. It's going to need all of us. Yeah. So, I've got to say, the thing about David Cameron coming back, it's very rare, because these guys do sort of, in the main, find out what's going on. It's very rare that you get something where you just go, wow, I never saw that coming.
You saw
right?
the chap on the BBC when Cameron started walking down Downing Street. Genuine shock.
That was, I think David Cameron just went in the building. So I get where your question is coming from, and I will never, ever forgive Cameron either for austerity or for the fact that he had the ridiculous referendum. But I think I've got to say, I think he's doing quite a good job. I think he's definitely putting the hours in. I think his big problem for Sunak is that I think he looks and sounds much more like a prime minister. And the question about Tony, I don't think Keir will ask him. Poor Tony. No, I don't. Look, I think the big difference about the thing is that Keir definitely knows that every single one of that new Labour team, whether it's Tony, whether it's Gordon, whether it's me, whether it's Peter Mandelson, he knows that if there's anything that he thinks we can usefully provide by the way of thinking and advice and experience and the rest of it, that everybody's up for it. Whereas I don't think Sunak really can feel that about most of his predecessors. And no, that is a big difference. That is a big difference. So I don't think he needs to. I actually think the other thing that's happened in the last year or so, I actually do feel the shadow cabinet has grown as well. I think Angela Rayner's if you haven't listened to her interview with us on the podcast, she's just an amazing person.
What's the relationship between Starmer and Blair like? How do you,
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Do they talk often?
Yeah, I think they chat. Yeah, I think Tony's. He doesn't bombard. I also think I mentioned the gentleman, the rock star guy, the whole think tank. I think Tony's institute is producing some really, really, really interesting policy ideas. And I think that's the other part of our politics that's hollowed out. The think tank world has just been taken over by these, Tufton Street. They're basically just an extension of the political game, as opposed to, we need the Resolution Foundation does some great stuff. We need, think tanks have got a really important role in policy development. And so I think Tony sees his role more as that. But I'm sure if Keir phoned him and said, Tony, I'm a bit tired today, do you want to take over? I think he'd go for that.
We have some people at the mic up there. Let's try doing all three, so you're going to have to remember what they're...
Okay. Need a pen for that.
Let's do it.
Can I have a bit of paper?
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, I'm listening.
2 parts. 1, why do we never get a female Labour leader? 2, should the next Labour leadership vote be an all-women shortlist?
Okay. Okay, next question.
Today there was a report that was backed by Lord Robertson, your first Chief Defence Secretary, talking about how Ireland is a backdoor for Russia and Iran and such. How do the EU...
Ireland is?
A backdoor for Russia and Iran through their neutrality. How do, with an EU hoping to expand and hopefully to have us back in it one day, how does Europe deal with Irish and Swiss neutrality and such?
Did George say that?
Yeah. Well, it was a report that was backed by him.
Right, okay.
And Michael Fallon.
Okay.
Hi. So I read the first volume of your diaries like a year and a half ago, and one of the things that struck me, there's like a passage, I think it's in the early 2000s, where you're having a conversation with Tony Blair and he says, shall we do PR? I think you maybe are advocating for yes. And he goes, I've thought about it. I think it's too much constitutional reform in one go. But you're like, let's put the Tories out for a generation. And, and in the end, he decides no, right? And does it ever kind of keep you up at night that, had you done that, all this mess, Brexit, you would have kept them out for a generation?
Oh. Did I say that? Because I was always a bit of a PR skeptic, because I still blow hot and cold on it. Do I wish we'd kept the Tories out for a generation? Yes, I absolutely do. Do I think that PR might be part of the way of doing that in the future? Yeah, possibly. Does it keep me awake at night? No.
But given your concerns around populism, I mean, PR is also a way for populist parties to get seats.
Absolutely. I mean, look, Wilders has just won the Dutch election. Now, he's still not been able to form a government, but that has its own disadvantage as well. He's actually gone considerably up in the polls since the election because he's not been able to form a government because the other parties are trying to stop him. I mentioned the AfD in Germany. I mean, they are on the march, and it's a PR system. So I don't think PR is a panacea, but as I said earlier, I do think our electoral system is bust, and we have to think about how we change it. I actually think also one of the things we talk a lot about on the podcast is this whole citizens' assemblies thing. I think it could be the first example of how you might use a citizens' assembly to try to come up with a different political system. One, it would expose to the country just how hard it is to do. There's no such thing as an easy, perfect political system. On the Irish-Swiss neutrality thing, I don't know what to think about that. I'd have to check it out. I hate talking about things that I don't know what the context is. But I don't think there's a problem. I think within the European Union, I don't buy the idea that having Ireland neutrality is somehow a sort of huge strategic issue for the rest of Europe or for NATO. I don't get that. But I will look that up because I'd be surprised if that was his view, but could be wrong. On the female, we've had two women leaders. Harriet Harman and Margaret Beckett have both been leaders of the Labour Party in interim roles. Okay, I accept that's not the same. But I thought it was interesting that I felt quite a muted reaction to the second part of your question. I'm a great believer in all-women shortlists, and I was in 1997, and I think we broke a lot of eggs to make a few omelettes, and we got some great women into Parliament. I think when it comes to the choice of who's going to be the leader of the Labour Party, and therefore the person that you think should be the Prime Minister, I think for that position to say we're cutting it down to 50% of the population, I don't support that, no. I do support, for example, what happens I think I'm right, the Welsh Assembly now has a system which guarantees there are 50-50, roughly, men and women within the Assembly. And I think we've now got a majority of women in the Welsh executive. But I think for the position of Prime Minister, no, I wouldn't support that. Is
there a deeper problem with Labour? I mean, we've had 3 female Prime Ministers. They've all been Tories.
Yeah.
I've asked Rachel Reeves about this before, and she will say that there is still a residual problem with left-wing sexism, or what you can call it what you like, sort of the old beer and sandwiches brigade and that sort of thing.
I think there is definitely within our... Look, there are some really, really great trade union leaders who are women now, okay, which there weren't when I was a journalist. There were none. So there has been progress within the trade union movement, but I think historically Labour's relations with the trade union has given it maybe a more masculine, macho bent than it maybe should have. But I think I'm sure there will be one for you, particularly for you guys. Eton has produced 21 prime ministers in our history. They were all men, by the way. The Labour Party's produced 6. So I actually think that's a bigger issue within our politics. I think is class as much as sex.
So we're going to do one more round of questions.
We've got a lot of questions up.
There's a couple of people right at the back there who have their hands up very...
That's definitely the Brexit guy.
You think? Are you the Brexit guy?
I've got the ear. My ear is...
Can we do... are there 2 of you there that have questions? Yeah, okay.
No, he was raising his hand, so we get increased probability of getting picked. Anyway, so during Rishi Sunak's term, inflation has more than halved. There has been legislation that's come in to reduce illegal immigration, and as well as to be decided if there's going to be economic growth and reduced debt. And my question for you is, you spoke a lot on what you saw a lot of visions that Keir Starmer could better Britain, but you didn't mention what he would actually do. So could you evaluate a bit more on that?
Well, I'm not I'm not a member of the Labour Party. Jeremy kicked me out. I think, look, I said earlier, I think he's got his 5 missions. I think that the manifesto is going to be built around them, and I think what he's deliberately doing is using them as strategic pillars, if you like, which come the manifesto will be set out with detailed policy. And actually, I think what he's done quite cleverly, this goes back to Josh's point about being quite I think he's a different sort of politician. I've been screaming week after week, you know, when's the big stuff going to come that we're going to know about? And I do think it's still to come.
Is that, I mean, you've studied a lot of electoral cycles. Yeah. Are they leaving it a little late in the day? Or, I mean, it's normal not to reveal too much policy in advance.
I feel they are. But at the same time, I think we're in a very, very different world to the one that we were. And I think that what you do when you have a sense of a kind of quite a blank canvas is that with this mood that is saying, you know, oh, well, Labour are going to win anyway, which, as I said, I don't subscribe to necessarily, but it means that if and when they are coming out with stuff, there's going to be an awful lot of interest in it. They're not going to want for attention. Whereas actually what is often the case for the opposition is you're really struggling to get attention.
Yeah, we'd all be thrilled to see some policy, I think.
Yeah,
absolutely. Very exciting.
Yeah.
I think we'll do one more question. Go on then. There's a chap right at the front here. Let's go there. Well, there's a microphone coming. You could,
no, because
they won't hear you at the back.
You've got the online people.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Distasteful though it may be, is there a case for tactical voting?
Is there a case for tactical voting? I don't think it's distasteful at all. Now, one of the advantages of having been kicked out of the Labour Party is that I think it's still a breach of the rule of the Labour Party membership to say that you should vote for another party, right? But I've got to say, if I lived in a constituency where the Lib Dems were 1,500 behind the Tories and Labour were a distant third, I would have no hesitation whatsoever. So I don't see that as distasteful at all. I think that, look, we talk about the electoral system. I actually do think that the driving narrative of this coming election, there's always a big question, right? And I think the driving narrative of this question is, can this country really take another term of this government? And if your answer to that is no, you vote for whatever you think helps you there. If you think that it is, then fine, you vote Tory. And, you know, let your kids pick up the pieces afterwards.
All right. I will remind you that Alice's book is just come out in paperback, and it is on sale somewhere at the back. So please do pick up a copy if you haven't got one already.
I shall wander up the back.
He will be signing books there. I just want to say thank you very much to Intelligence Squared for having us, and thank you for Alastair for a very interesting and entertaining evening.
Thank you. Thank you.